Thank you. This is profoundly embarrassing on a number of levels. One is that all of you know what goes first as you get older, but you're all wrong. It's your teeth. And that is why I have this funny lisp, because I have new teeth. So bear with me on those grounds. It's also embarrassing because this is an intensely personal story, and I'm an intensely emotional person, and I sometimes cry when I tell it. So if I break down, just send for the psychiatrist and it'll all be okay. It's also embarrassing because there is this notion that I, Mike Jacobs, am a Pulitzer Prize winner. This is not true. The Pulitzer Prize was for the staff of the Grand Forks Herald. Now, I was there. We did a great thing, I believe, and I'm proud of it, but I didn't do it. This came home to me very, very powerfully when, after the gold medal was in my possession, I called my mother in Stanley, North Dakota, and I said, I'm bringing the Pulitzer Prize gold medal for public service for you to look at. And she said, see you later. So I drove across the state to Stanley, which is my hometown, and I was overcome with joy at the Mouse River crossing near Towner. And I stopped, and I got out of the car, and I walked around for a half an hour celebrating myself and listening to the birds. I got to Stanley, I got out of the car, I walked up to the door, my mother opened it and said, you're late, the rolls are cold. So I understood that I had really transgressed. I had gotten so full of myself that I didn't appreciate that my mother was going to bake fresh cinnamon rolls for me to celebrate this little triumph. So, I want to set the stage here by pointing out that North Dakota has a really quite special relationship with the Pulitzer Prizes. There are 12 Pulitzer winners with North Dakota roots. That seems to me to be an incredible number. Now, I didn't do the research that would tell me how many other states around here have, except that the number for South Dakota is 0. I'm only saying. There are three awards to newspapers. The Bismarck Tribune for public service in 1938. The Forum of Fargo for local reporting, edition time, they called it in those days, basically deadline reporting. In 1958 for the Golden Ridge Tornado, and of course the Herald. There are 3 to journalists who grew up in North Dakota or were trained in North Dakota. Famously, Mel Reuter, who grew up in Bismarck, graduated from UND, and edited the Hungry Horse News in Columbia Falls, Montana. Won a Pulitzer for local reporting in 1965 for coverage, believe it or not, of a disastrous flood. Bill Ketter, recruited to UND from northern Minnesota as a goalie for a hockey team, so kind of appropriate that we're here. Became the publisher of the Lawrence, Massachusetts Eagle, and during his tenure, the Eagle won a local reporting Pulitzer. And Rob Kuznia, who won last year for coverage of a corrupt school board in Torrance, California, not at Torrance, but at the Daily Breeze in Torrance, California, in Orange County. It became quite an important national story. We have 2 Pulitzer winners who have been on the faculty at the University of North Dakota. Rich Argood, whom you all know, he left UND a couple of years ago, And Mark Trahant, who will be here later today, was a named finalist in national reporting. And the Herald photo staff was a named finalist for photography in 1998. And there are 3 Pulitzers in non-journalism categories. One for Maxwell Anderson, who taught high school in where? Minnewacan, and left there for the bright lights of Broadway, and one for drama in 1935, the first Pulitzer winner from North Dakota. And the 2 latest history prizes are to people writing about North Dakota topics. Elizabeth Fenn of the University of Colorado at Boulder for her really astonishing book called Encounters at the Heart of the World, which is a history of the Mandan people. And this year's winner, which I haven't yet read but is in my briefcase, T.J. Stiles' biography of George Armstrong Custer called Custer's Trials. So that makes 12, if I haven't missed any, Pulitzers in North Dakota, which I think is really quite a remarkable achievement for a small state. The Herald's Pulitzer was not so much earned, I would say, as given. I look at it as a gift of the river. So what I want to do today is what I do in high school classes when I go to appear as the North Dakota Newspaper Association ambassador. I look these young people in the eye and I say, there are a few questions that you ought to ask. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And I make them ask those questions. And they're smart enough to figure out that I'm doing it in order. So they count off and they know, before I get to them, what their question is going to have to be. I'm not going to do that with you because I know you would get out of order, which no presenter can stand. The audience must, at all costs, be kept orderly. That is the principal responsibility of a speaker. So I am going to ask myself the questions. How did the Herald win a Pulitzer Prize? The who is the Herald, the what is the Pulitzer Prize. The why, I think, is the eyes on the prize phrase that Jackie so appropriately invoked in her presentation. We didn't set out to win a Pulitzer Prize, but it did occur to us that there was a Pulitzer Prize to be won. And partly I think this is because when I was a sophomore at the University of North Dakota, that was in 1966, Mel Reuter came to the campus, fresh from having won the Pulitzer in Montana, and talked about it. And his message basically was, come on kids, Columbia Falls, Montana, you can win a Pulitzer Prize. And that message stuck with me. So, I didn't approach the 1997 flood thinking, this is the Pulitzer. But I wasn't, I recognized that there was an opportunity in a flood to win a Pulitzer. Order doesn't extend to the speaker himself, by the way. So, how did this happen? And I think all of you already know the answer to that question because when Steve Andrus interviewed me for the first of the consecutive times that my picture was on the cover of the Publishers Quarterly, a deeply embarrassing experience, by the way.
Good picture, though.
And you, there is this. I'm going to get spiritual here pretty soon, but here's the theology. There is a special place in hell for somebody who schedules me between Jackie Banaszynski and Carol Kusi. There is a special place in hell for that. So, what I told Steve and what I really believe is we were ready. We were ready. And I mean that literally. We understood that the whole time we were in Grand Forks, every time we looked at the river, we understood that this was a flooding river and that there was a potential for a catastrophic flood. We understood that it's part of the marrow of journalism in Grand Forks. And I think it always has been, because Grand Forks had several catastrophic floods previously, including one in 1897, which took away about half of the downtown. Literally, it ended up in Lake Winnipeg. So we knew that floods were possible. Additionally, the flood following the blizzard of 1966 was catastrophic and resulted in a very expensive diking system in Grand Forks, which gave us protection to 49 feet, which of course was the forecast that the National Weather Service gave us. Many of you will remember my very favorite picture that ran in the Grand Forks Herald. I wish I'd thought to bring it. It was a house sitting off its foundation at the east end of the Kennedy Bridge in East Grand Forks, and someone had painted on the side of the house, 49 feet my ass. That of course became a very important, and in fact an ongoing story of the flood was the dreadful miscalculation that the National Weather Service made, and their refusal to come to grips with it until, in fact, the river was at 49 feet, level with the top of the dike, and clearly not going any lower. A 49-foot flood stage we could have handled. It was the 61.5 inches that came after the 49 feet that defeated us. And you can't build basically a 6-foot dike that quickly. So that's why the Herald won a Pulitzer. The water came over the dikes. I can, if you care to, you can ask me about the mechanics of this. But the simple fact of the matter is that we were ready, and the second thing is we had a lot of help. It happened that Mike Maidenberg, who was the publisher at the time, and myself were evacuated to Thompson, which was very sensible of us since Thompson is south of Grand Forks and the river runs north. So we were quite proud of ourselves. And when we recognized the extent of what had happened overnight, we got together at Dwight and Sherry Kalish's house. It pays to have friends. Dwight was very sick. He had spent much of the week prior to the flood crest at Mayo Clinic, and he had gotten a very doleful diagnosis. But he and Sherry didn't hesitate to invite Suzette and me and our 4 cats and another couple from Grand Forks and their 2 children and a dog and a cat to join them and their son and a dog and a cat. There were, I've forgotten exactly how many, but I think the total is 42 legs in the house. So it pays to have friends. Mike and I, the other thing about the Kalishes is that they're small people. And Mike Maidenberg and I are both tall people, and we were sitting in their kitchen nook, and we realized that the nook had been built for men who were maybe 5'6", rather than 6'4". And so we moved out to the deck, and it was on that deck. It was a beautiful morning. This is the thing that is so clear in my mind about the morning of the flood in Grand Forks. It was a drop-dead gorgeous spring morning. There, the swans were flying north, making that wonderful noise that they make. It was a beautiful morning, and we said, how in the hell are we going to get a newspaper out? And we agreed, we'll Xerox it. We'll mimeograph it if we have to. And Mike said, that's not going to be necessary. And he called St. Paul, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and we were able to get space in their newsroom and time on their press. And so that's what we did. We went there. We physically went. This was very foolish of us. Going to Thompson was pretty smart. Going to the University of North Dakota Student Union turned out not to be very smart. They had computers and they had telephones, but the city water system failed. They didn't have bathrooms. It was very uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable. So we obviously had to find another place to publish. And my assistant at the time, a woman named Janelle Stadstead, had graduated from grade school in Manville, which is north of Grand Forks. And she knew that the Manville grade school had a computer lab with 25 Macs and 2 bathrooms, boys and girls. And so I called Richard Ray, the principal at the Manville School, and said, I'm coming up with all of these people, and we're going to make the Manville School the office of the Grand Forks Herald. And that's literally what we did. We took over most of the school. We put our computer bank in the music room. We put our executive offices in the library. We put our circulation department in one of the classrooms, and so on. We ate with the kids. We went to the bathroom with the kids. There were only 2 rules. No running in the halls, and smoking outdoors only. This is 1998. The world is 1997, actually. The world is different then. So that's what we did. We stuck it out, as Jackie said. We had a lot of help from Knight Ridder, which at that time owned both the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the Grand Forks Herald. And over the course of about 6 weeks, we probably had 40 or 50 journalists who came from other Knight Ridder papers. When the Pulitzer Prize was awarded, we printed up certificates, and we sent one to each and every one of them that said a piece of the Pulitzer with their name on it, and we gave one to everybody who worked there. Because it's really important that this was an effort in common. We got by with a lot of help from our friends. That's the plain truth of it. We also, however, were enormously aided, I think, by 2 things. One, we understood the tenets, the basic principles of the craft. And we knew how the community worked. One of the things that we had done in the run-up to the flood was get to know all of the emergency officials and say to them, not, are you ready, but what are you really worried about? Where if there's a weakness in the flood fight, where is it? And so we knew how the flood was going to progress. At least we knew how they thought the flood was going to progress, so that we were always able to say, well, we're at this level. They're going to have to start shutting down, the pumping station on the south end, which means, of course, a mandatory evacuation, because you don't let people live in their houses without proper sewage treatment anymore these days. Although some did do it. So there was that. And then there was also the importance that we all placed on doing this the proper journalistic way. And that really played out in the famous story of the angel. The angel donated $15 million anonymously to Grand Forks and East Grand Forks, with the proviso that the money be distributed $2,000 to every head of household. And then she doubled down with a second $15 million. There were two immediate problems. One was that people are not always honest. And so people began appearing and claiming to be heads of households, when in fact they were a married couple, and so they were both collecting. In some cases, there were married couples with adult children who were collecting several times. So we thought that was newsworthy. This got a fairly negative reaction, but not nearly so negative as our decision to out the angel. And that came about in the following way. I had been relieved, so to speak, by the managing editor of the Philadelphia Daily News, who was sent out to be sort of the surrogate editor for a couple of days so I could get a break. So what I do under intense personal stress, Suzette's here, she'll affirm this, is I get in my pickup and I drive to the Badlands and I sleep on the ground. So that is what I had done. And I was on my way back to Grand Forks, and I stopped in Watford City at the Senex station that used to be there before the boom came and the bank took over the property and built a magnificent building. And the devil made me call the office. And my surrogate said, his name was Brian Toulon, said, we know who the angel is. And I said, got to print it. We got to print it. So there was a short discussion, and they prepared a story, and I stopped in Stanley and called again, and they read me the story, and they said, go with it. All hell broke loose. We had betrayed a trust. We had just basically spat in the face of the woman who gave us $30 million. So I had to come up with a justification. Well, I didn't have to come up with one. I had to explain the justification, which was it's timely, it's important public information, and it's timely, and it's of public interest. I also pointed out that the angel had flown into Grand Forks in a Lear jet and landed at the airport. This attracts some attention in Grand Forks. I mean, if she really wanted to be anonymous, she would have driven into Grand Forks in a beat-up pickup with a gun rack. That's the way you sneak into Grand Forks. But no, she flew in a Learjet. And then she made a vital error. She refueled and used her credit card. So she, two things happened then. One is, of course, aircraft are registered, and they have wing numbers which can be traced. So we knew already who the jet belonged to. But examining the credit card receipt, which is a public record under the laws of the state of North Dakota because it was issued by the Grand Forks County Airport Authority, we were able to confirm that the angel's name, in fact, was Joan Kroc, the McDonald's heiress, who could afford to give away $30 million, and who had been basically assured by the powers that be in Grand Forks that this money had been distributed in exactly the way that she had intended. So anyway, we were faithful to the craft and the profession. I liked Jackie's advice about talking to strangers. one of the things that I did, was to drive into town, that is into Grand Forks, every day and walk around in a different neighborhood and talk to people and to hear and listen, just to listen to their stories. And I did that in advance of writing the next day's editorial. And that allowed me to assume a voice and an authority that I would never have had on my own, because I understood a couple of things. One is that nature is indifferent. You know, everyone was a victim. Didn't matter whether you were the mayor, didn't matter if you were the priest, it didn't matter if you were the millionaire, it didn't matter if you were on welfare. Everybody was affected. So that made it a community catastrophe of quite a different kind than would have been the case had the whole community not been affected. The other thing it did is it helped me to talk in the editorials in a deeply personal kind of way. So I liked that advice. I think that's good advice. The other story I want to tell, and this is where it gets a little bit spiritual, is about cleaning up the basement. Now, the job of cleaning up the flood fell to Suzette because I was busy. I was doing stuff I thought was important. And so she basically undertook the cleanup. But she couldn't get the freezer out of the basement. So, that was not a... So we called my friend Scotty Kadelka, who was the ranger at Icelandic State Park, and he drove down. I took Scotty to the public health office, got him a tetanus shot, and we went to tackle the freezer. And we tore the goddamn thing apart and managed to get it upstairs and out onto the berm, and we flipped it over onto the berm. This is the other thing I have to say about the flood. Walking around showed me what rich people have in their houses, because it was all dumped out on the berm. I mean, it was really quite fascinating to see what people were getting rid of. And really, I wish I had been, in hindsight, I wish I'd had a little bit more time, because I would have gone around with a pickup and picked up things, because they weren't really damaged. They were just a little bit muddy, but there was this visceral, get rid of it kind of feeling that we had. Anyway, Scotty and I get the freezer up on the berm, and along comes the Red Cross truck. And it's raining a little bit. It's a cool May morning. And the red truck stops, and we walk up, and a woman from New Jersey looks at us, and I looked at her. She hands me a cup of coffee, and I look at her, and I was looking into the eyes of God. That woman had no business being in Grand Forks. She'd never been west of Philadelphia. She knew none of us. She didn't know the city. She came because she heard the story, and she wanted to help. That's a basic human response. So I said that nature is indifferent. God may sift souls, but he does not sift bodies. Everybody, that catastrophe affected everybody. Our job as journalists, it seems to me, is to understand the interface there between the human and the bigger than human things that we confront in communities. It's our job to tell stories in ways that understand and communicate how communities are stitched together. So I've got a couple of pieces of advice, and then I'm going to quit. Most of you, I think, know that as publisher of the Herald, as editor as well, I was charged with staff reductions. I told Eddie Schaefer, who was the interim president at UND, that I had taken 10% out of the Grand Forks Herald more than twice. And so I was pretty sure that he could take 4 or 8 or whatever percent needed to be taken out of UND. Now I've lost my train of thought. Why am I telling you about this?
We knew it would happen.
Okay, now the second thing is gone. First the teeth, and then the brain. As you said in your editorial. The pieces of advice. Because I had cut the staff, there was nobody to cover the county commission. And so I thought, I know how to cover the county commission. And I went and covered the county commission. I'll tell you, you should cover the county commission. Everything comes to the county commission. Everything shows up at the county commission. And not only that, sometimes the county commission takes a piece of it. And then you've got a really good story. But to really understand a community, the place to start is the county commission. It's true in Williston and Williams County. It's true in Crosby and Divide County. It's true in Grand Forks and Grand Forks County. And I want to also suggest that you should cover the school board. You know, it was Rob Kuznia's great good luck to be covering the school board in this impoverished school district, and to listen to what was going on at the school board, and to asking questions, and to staying a little bit longer, that led him to this story about the corruption in this school board. The enrichment of school officials who were taking, $500,000 salaries and larger expense accounts, from the public funds in this school district. Those stories are there. I'm not saying they're there in Crosby. I'm not saying they're there in Minnewacan. I'm not saying they're there in Williston, but they might be. And the way you discover them is hanging around, listening, talking, wondering, working, practicing journalism. So, questions?
I didn't hear you mention the loss of your building.
Well, the building burned down. I mean, maybe it's not true that the Pulitzer was a gift of the river. It might have been the gift of the guy who left the power on in the building down the street where the electricity arced and set fire to this 1895 pile that was on the opposite corner of the block. That may be why we won the Pulitzer Prize, because it was pretty hard to resist the television footage of a city underwater that was also burning down. It was an irresistible image. And if you don't believe it, here's the picture. Plus, we had an inspired headline writer. Now, you thought the headline and the newspaper Olympics last night was a well-crafted headline. This is a great headline. Come hell and high water. Jeff Beach wrote that headline. He's now the news editor for Forum News Service. I think he'll be here tonight. I think he's on his way. Yeah. And he was deputized to go to St. Paul. So he was in St. Paul when he got this. Now, I told you this is embarrassing. I was in Grand Forks editing the story. Here's the lead. Traumatized Grand Forks residents continued their exodus from flood-ravaged neighborhood Sunday, even as they struggled to cope with the devastation wrought by fires that left the downtown looking like a war zone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. Period, at last. The Pulitzer, the Herald's Pulitzer is not a prize for quality of journalism. It did work, yeah. But my motto ever since that appeared has been never use one sentence. when two will do. Did I read you the citation? I meant to read you the Pulitzer citation because it's very instructive. When I so rudely ducked out, literally, of Jackie's presentation, it was to be interviewed by the local TV. I was interviewed by both stations at once. It was quite an experience. Competing stations interviewing the same subject at the same time. So I read them the citation. Awarded to the staff of the Grand Forks Herald for, quote, sustained and informative coverage, vividly illustrated with photographs, that helped hold its community together in the wake of flooding, a blizzard, and a fire that devastated much of the community, including the newspaper plant itself. So it's survival that's being honored here. Other questions? Yeah.
Didn't you, I think you had talked about this regarding the power situation. Didn't you kind of take a risk and go down to the power buses, the power system in the Herald building, shut the power off before the water got into the press?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty close to the water.
Yeah, well, here is the dramatic moment itself. Yeah, we were under assault on KCNN radio. A talk show host named Scott Hennon was inviting people to call and tell him how much they feared for their families who were working at the Grand Forks Herald. So I drove over to KCNN, which is in the old Depot building, if you know downtown Grand Forks. It's about 3 blocks from the Herald. I drove over at the time I owned a Toyota Land Rover, a butch vehicle. So I drove over, I did a brief talk on the radio, and I drove back against the water coming up the street, and I parked in front, and I went in, and I said to the pressman, turn off the power and load all the papers you can in the truck. And we loaded every vehicle that was there that was able to maneuver in the streets, and took papers to basically to the flood crisis center, the emergency center, which was crucially west of the interstate. Interstates make wonderful dams. You know, it's best dike ever. Unless the water had come from the other direction, of course, which is what happened in 1989? Yeah. They all run together eventually. So yes, we had to kill the power in the building and turn on and actually stop the press. You know, all of you who are newspaper people will love this part of the story. Of course, the building filled up with water. It was about waist deep in the first floor of the building. The press was in a double basement. You know, so it was one of these big old presses. And the sub basement, you know, was 3 stories high. You know, basement, first floor, and then an open space above the first floor, and then paper below, and which makes good sense because, of course, it's easier to load it into the press. But what happens to paper when it gets wet? It expands in a truly amazing way. So all of the rods on the press were bent, and the boards in the floor were heaved up. They went in with chainsaws to take the paper off the press and to cut it up in the sub-basement. It was really quite an undertaking. They refurbished the press and sent it to Kazakhstan. So somebody in Kazakhstan is probably still reading blurry type and fuzzy pictures on our old press. We initially printed in St. Paul. The newspaper was flown back to airports in Crookston, Minnesota, and west of Grand Forks because you couldn't get back and forth across the river. That's what the I didn't bring the paper with the bridge photo on it. Then after about, I don't know, 3 weeks, we were able, because the bridges opened, we were able, and Interstate 29 opened, we contracted with Morgan Printing, which prints the Walsh County Record in Grafton, and with Forum to print the paper. And we brought it together in Grand Forks and hired every available teenage male to stuff it. The Olympic exercise last night. You couldn't buy a burger in Grand Forks for 6-8 weeks after the flood because we paid more than McDonald's to stuff the paper together. And so literally, the town basically shut down after about the time the press started, because that's when we needed all the labor to put.
Bit of irony in that, Mike, that McDonald's also.
Pardon?
It was a bit of irony in that you put McDonald's.
Yeah,
to work today, the
yeah,
ones
it's
that
a
bought
bit of
McDonald's.
irony. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
You had mentioned that, with going back to the Angel, you had mentioned that several members of the same household were coming in to collect checks, and then that.
Actually, well, yeah, they were checks, I guess. We paid in cash. This is another amazing thing. Have you ever, the Grand Forks Herald at the time employed about 180 people, and we had cash enough to pay all of them. I've never seen that much cash in one place. Yes,
then,
go ahead. Sorry.
Kroc was assured by the powers that be that her money was being handed out the way that she wanted it to be. Was it not? And was that your justification for running her name?
No, we would have run her name anyway. I only told that story, because the best laid plans go awry. And in that case, her really quite benevolent notion that you could give every head of household $2,000 proved to be mistaken, basically through human greed. But no, had that not happened, and we had learned that Joan Kroc was the angel, we would have published it. Again, because what I said in the front page editorial was, if we hadn't told you who this person was, this person who came to town in an ostentatious way, who was given a eyes-only tour of the flood, including your houses, if we hadn't told you who she was, you would have had no reason to trust us ever again. There would have been no reason for you to pay $181 a year to get a daily newspaper published by this bunch of people who won't give you the basic thing that they have promised, which is accurate, timely information. That's the promise. That's the business promise. You don't fulfill the business promise, you don't expect customers. It's that simple, I think. So yes, on business grounds and on grounds of journalistic principle, we would have printed her name. Yes.
Talk about the economics of the flood to the newspaper. Had you been independently owned, you might not have made it. Knight Ridder made quite a contribution to keep things going. You lost your advertisers. Can you talk about that, Mike?
We had a $13.5 million loss. 8.5 million insurable. We had business interruption insurance. And so most of the loss was covered. But, and I say this without fear of contradiction, the Herald is still paying for the flood because the flood forced us to make decisions that were not in the long-term interest of the business. Specifically, we had to build a newspaper plant west of the interstate because no one would loan you money to put an $8 million press in a building in a floodplain that had just sustained the kind of damage that downtown Grand Forks had sustained. And so just as a getting back into business proposition, we needed to make that investment. We also elected to build what in hindsight turned out to be an extravagant building. Fortunately, this is no longer my concern. It's your concern. So we overbuilt. And while I was still publisher, one of the things I did to try to ameliorate that was rent out about a third of the space in the building, which was prudent from a business point of view. The argument in favor of the building downtown was that this community needs a leader to bring downtown back. And that was what motivated Mike Maidenberg. Immediately after the flood, Mike was invited to go to Columbia University, which was his alma mater, to talk about the flood experience. And he was gone when the president of the bank called me and said, I'm getting some downtown business people together to talk about what's going to happen. So I went to the meeting, and he said, we've hired this planner whose promise is to rebuild Grand Forks as a 21st century city. Great concept, I thought. I like that kind of talk. His idea was that we were going to move everything to the intersection of Interstate 29 and 32nd Avenue South. And we were going to build this architecturally appealing, he had all sorts of great words about it. And so when Mike got back, I told him, here's the plan that the bank guy was touting. And Mike said, we're not going to do that. And our decision, the Herald's decision, not to be any part of that plan, really doomed it, because the Herald and the bank were at the time the businesses downtown. And it turned out to be the right decision, but it saddled the Herald with two buildings. And then the city thanked us by increasing our property taxes by 195%. So we made the American crystal sugar argument, which those of you in beet country know, which is this property might have cost us X number of $1 million to build, but it has no value as real property because it can't be sold. A sugar beet plant is a sugar beet plant is a sugar beet plant. It can't be repurposed. So you're taxing the income we get out of the sugar beet plant. You can't also tax the property itself, because the property really doesn't have the value of what we paid to build it. And we made that argument for the press building. And they gave us back some percentage. But I'm pissed off about this. I had coffee with Corey Wenzel, who's my successor as publisher of the Herald, and I looked at him and I said, "You are seeing the face of a happy former publisher." I'm not having to deal with the issues that arise on a daily basis in the newspaper business. I tell people I still go to work, I still write a column, I write 2 columns a week for the Herald, but now I work in my pajamas. It's not a pretty sight, but. Other questions?
Mike,
Yeah.
I think we're out of
Are we out of time? Great.